All right. Well, chapter 14 is on urbanization, cities, migration, and challenges within those cities. And so we don't live in an urban environment here in Southern Illinois. And so much of this stuff is not something that maybe we would intuitively understand. However, increasingly, people around the world are living in cities. In fact, I think in 2008, the scale tipped where the majority of the population of planet Earth now lives in an urban environment. So, even though we don't, at least right now, it is possible that some of you will, at least during some portion of your life, live in the cities. And even if we never do, we live in a democracy, and so people in the cities may see the world differently than people in the rural environments. In fact, studies show they tend to. And so it's still going to impact us in that sense. So, why do people live in the cities? And so cities always kind of had an attraction to people. And typically that attraction involved excitement. There are more people and there's more social events happening in the cities, and it's faster, and there's money, and there are celebrities, and life is certainly faster in the cities than it is in the more rural areas. And jobs. Probably jobs are probably the largest things that really attract people to the city. And I don't even know that it's necessarily the jobs are there, but it's the belief that the thoughts are there. And so today, there are thousands of Chinese people leaving the countryside every day, moving to the cities because they believe that's where the jobs are. And also in the United States, many people are moving to the United States, and they're not living in rural areas like ours. They're moving to the cities. So, all right. So, are cities great places to be? Well, yes and no. They are places where a lot of rich people live. There are a lot of high paying jobs there, but there are also a lot of poor people there. There's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of crime, there's a lot of pollution. You've got a lot of people and vehicles and buildings and manufacturing kind of all really close together without the natural environment there to sort of dilute those toxins. And so that crowding really does make an impact in terms of the amount of pollution that people's bodies are taking in. And while there's a lot of infrastructure, and in fact, for me personally, one of the more interesting things about cities is the infrastructure. The buildings, the bridges, the statues, the sidewalks, the stuff that people have made, the waterways. A lot of that infrastructure is aging in the American cities. So you have old bridges, old waterways, old buildings. Migration plays an especially important role in the United States as we are a land of immigrants by and large. Right? And so migration is just the movement of people. And so it could be domestic migration, which is moving people from one area of the country to another. So from, say, Tennessee to Missouri, that would be migration. Right? Illinois, unfortunately, is a place that has a lot of people migrating out of it, and which we call immigrants, people who are leaving Illinois. In fact, Illinois in 2016 lost 37,500 people. Right? Now, why do people move at all? Because moving actually is tough. Especially if you have a family, especially if you've been in a place for a longer time. When people are younger, it's actually easy to move because you don't have jobs, you don't have as many connections to place. But when you're in your 50 years old, it is difficult to pick up and leave one area and move to another. So why do people move? People oftentimes move because they want to be closer to family, especially if they have children. Family helps them raise those children. Jobs are a big reason why people leave. It's oftentimes very justifiable in people's minds if you say, hey, I'm going to Mississippi. Why? Oh, well, they offered me a job making twice what I make here. And people are like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense, right? A better climate. We are moving out of the northern cities. This is cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, New York. And we are moving to southern cities like Atlanta, like Houston, Austin, somewhere in Arizona. And largely that is because there's a better climate there and there's less regulations. And so companies feel like it is easier to run a factory in Mississippi, although not Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, than it is to have one in New York, with a lot more regulations there. And so, I think ultimately people would say, oh, I'm moving for a better life. That's what a lot of the immigrants who move to the United States are believing. They're moving to the United States for a better life, so they can have more freedom, so they can have better job opportunities, so they can feel like they're investing in their children's lives, so that when they grow up, they'll have opportunities that other people won't. Cruising right along. Urbanization. Urbanization is the shifting from rural areas to urban, or the shifting of a population from living in from rural areas to urban areas. When it comes to urbanization, it has happened in waves. It first happened in Europe in 1750 to 1950, so it's a 200-year period, where people moved to the cities from the rural countryside, where they were probably logging or farming or fishing or something like that, to the industrial centers, which were the cities, or if they weren't the cities before the industry came, they were afterward, because people needed to live very close to where they worked. And so you had industrial areas being put down, and then around those industrial areas became housing, and then everything else that supports the people who are living there, stores and whatnot. But that was for Europe and the United States too. The second wave was from 1950 to 2000, although I guess you could say it's still happening today. This is where it happened in Asia and Africa, where you have a very similar thing. People are leaving the countrysides and moving to the industrial areas of the city. And just like London was very overcrowded, New York, very overcrowded, dirty, you could say polluted. Today, the cities that are having the urbanization in Africa and Asia are very dirty and overcrowded, and there's not enough laws that would be, in place to create safe living situations for people. And so it's like we made the mistake 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Today it's happening, those same mistakes are happening in Asia and Africa, where you have a lot of over-urbanization, right? While we're not urbanizing as much in the United States today, especially not due to COVID, but we are suburbanizing, where people are moving from the countryside to the suburbs, or from the city to the suburbs, especially after they have children. And then we're moving from the snow belt, remember that's the Detroit, New York, Boston area, down to the sun belt. This is Florida. Florida is just exploding, but also other southern places that are much warmer than the northern ones. All right, well, let's talk about suburbs and why we have a fascination with them. So previous to World War II, we didn't have as many suburbs because we didn't have the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the water systems, the sewage that would have supported those suburbs. After World War II, we began building outside of the urban areas through the Housing Act of 1949. And it was thought of as being the best of the country and the city. You had the city that was, 20 miles away, probably less than that, 10 miles away, but it may take you 30, 40 minutes to get there, and the country where you had clean air and you had wide streets and you had, single dwelling units, whereas in the city you had apartment buildings that were tall and you didn't have a yard. And so you have the city, which can offer you the excitement and the nightlife and the plays and the diversity and the ethnic food, but then you could go home and sleep in a quiet neighborhood and kind of have the country, sort of country living, so to speak. So it was also attractive because it was segregated. When you had a lot of people of color moving to the cities after World War II, you had a lot of white people that were leaving the cities because of the influx of people of color, and the suburbs sort of offered them the seclusion from those people that they were seeking after. Also thought of as being safer than the cities, because suburbs are really a place where you have to have more money, you have to have transportation whereas in the city there's a lot more public transportation, and so it kind of excluded poor people just by the very nature that you had to have a vehicle in order to be there. So we're going to kind of venture off for one slide here and talk about some decisions that we can make one way or another. And so when it comes to a city and deciding where to put their money, they've got a couple of options here. You can invest in people being independent by driving their own vehicle, let's say, and that would be building more roads, which is the path that we've been on for the last 70 years. Or you can say, you know what, we want to do more communal, more public systems, and this would be hire more bus drivers. You can allow people to have their own private property, bigger yards, or you can build more public parks, right? You can have taller buildings, or you can limit the size of the buildings. You can have bilingual street signs, or you can just have the traditional ones that are just in English. And so one of these choices leads to people living closer together and people being more communal. They're sharing more stuff. If you think about a bus as being like a communal car, a communal transportation, we're all sharing it. We're all sharing the bus. Whereas of our individual vehicles, that's just one person's, right? It's obviously much, much cheaper to share something than it is for all of us to own a vehicle, which we only use, I think, 10% of the time at most. But it kind of takes away people's independence and their ability to do things without other people. And so, by and large, we like the idea of our own stuff, right? We don't really like sharing as much. But if you're poor or if you're new to the place, then having more communal stuff is definitely beneficial. And millennials are more into sharing things than other generations. Millennials are driving less of them are interested in getting their license. They're more mobile, meaning they're not as attached to an individual place, an individual city, an individual job. They're more willing to move around. They're less connected to an area, and they're wanting to live in more urban areas that are walkable. Our urban areas, especially our new urban areas like Atlanta, Houston, are very you need a car in order to get around those. In the past, our older cities, not as many people had cars, like Chicago and San Francisco and New York. They are much more compact. So you could really walk to work. You could walk to the grocery store. You could walk to the park. In Atlanta, you're not going to be able to do that unless you really live in just the heart of the downtown. But outside of that, you almost have to have a vehicle, or at least you're riding the bus maybe for a long time while you're doing that. And so COVID's kind of thrown a curveball into this whole thing because people have been leaving the cities because many people are telecommuting. Like they're Zooming into work, and they're doing most of the work from their house. And so it's much cheaper, and you get more house if you move away from the city. So people are moving out of the cities because there's just not much point in being there. But I don't know if that trend's going to continue. Like, are the cities going to become less attractive in 10 years like they are at this moment? I don't know the answer to that question. But anyway, just an interesting thing about like how should a city invest, and that's like urban planning if you're interested in looking into that more. So, all right. So, what are some of the consequences of urbanization? And so, urban centers, I mentioned before, are less white because many white people left the urban centers during the 70s and the 80s. The suburbs were being built, and so probably some of them left just because they wanted to move out of the city and have some green space, but still be close to their job. Some of them left because they didn't like the diversity that was coming into the cities. And what that means is you in a city, especially like an inner city, is that you have a lot more minorities and poor who are in those parts that are isolated, that they're isolated from the money, they're socially isolated from the rest of the groups of people. Oftentimes that housing is old, and so it's going to have problems with heating and plumbing. Um, Now, since the 90s, some whites have moved back into the urban areas, and that has caused certain neighborhoods to undergo what they call gentrification. And so whites are moving from the suburbs, or maybe the children of the whites are moving from the suburbs to the urban areas, and they're bringing some of their wealth with them. And they're saying, well, I want to live in the city, but I can spend more money on housing, and so I'd like to live in a nicer place. And so developers are coming in and they're buying up buildings that traditionally poor people have lived in, and they're renovating them and increasing the price of rent. And then another building across the road does the same thing. And so the neighborhood is changing and becoming wealthier. And so on the one hand, this is nice because the buildings are much nicer, and it increases the value of the neighborhood, but it also leaves a smaller portion of housing left for people who are poor and can't afford the newer buildings. Crowding occurs because you have a lot of people who want to live in a little section of land, right? So if you've got 1,000 people and they all want to live on one block, well, you almost have to go up or go down, right? And going down is very expensive. So typically we build buildings up, and so that works because you're able to have many people living in this small space, but you're going to increase the number. You're increasing the crowding. What happens when you have a small space, when you have a lot of people in that space? Maybe an individual home, if you think about that. Maybe you got mom and you got dad and you got cousin and you got grandma all living in, say, a 2-bedroom place. So that child is more likely to have problems at school. You're more likely to have problems between the parents and the children. I think that the space kind of allows us to kind of avoid problems because I'm just not running into you as often, so I don't see what's going on that bugs me. You're going to have more criticism from parents to kids, and then the faster spreading of disease. If you think about what happened with COVID-19 in the very beginning, where were the major epicenters? It was New York City. And why New York City and not Atlanta, let's say? Well, you have a lot more crowding in New York City and a lot less of it in Atlanta. And then overall, you have increased stress. Well, let's talk about homelessness, right? We're going to include people who don't have homes, but we're not going to include people who are staying with friends. Right? So on any given night, there's about 500,000 people who are homeless. Thankfully, about the majority of them, about 70% of them, are in shelters, but about 30% of them are in unsheltered locations. So this is on a park bench, in their car. Probably a lot of them are in their car if they have one, or they're sleeping under a bridge or something like that. And so homelessness becomes a trap where once somebody is in that situation for 6 months or a year and a half, it becomes very difficult for them to leave homelessness. As much as we would hope that when people yell at them, get a job, if they could get a job, they would. It's not that easy. Unfortunately, we kind of forget all the things that would be required for the person to get a job. They have to change clothes, and they have to get a resume, and they have to be near their job. Homelessness happens a lot more in the cities because it's the price of housing that causes people to become homeless. If you think about where homeless people are, they're in major cities with very expensive housing. And it's probably just because, as the price of housing goes up, less and less people can afford it. And so the majority of people figure out some sort of solution. They share housing with somebody else, or they move to a place that's less expensive. But the 1% of people who aren't able to do that or can't do that, they live with their aunt until that situation no longer works out, and then they move to their car, and now they're considered homeless. But if they're not working, then they may lose the ability to even live in that car. And so housing prices have a direct impact on who is homeless and who is not. Mental illness plays a role. Whether somebody's mentally ill before they become homeless or afterward, I'm not sure. But certainly if you look at who is homeless, and more mentally ill people are homeless than there are in the general population. Substance abuse plays a role. And again, I'm not sure if it's substance abuse that leads people to homelessness. I'm sure that it does in some situations. Or it's that being homeless is so difficult that people develop substance abuse issues in order to cope with being homeless. Who are the homeless? 25% of them are minors. That means they're under 18. And so this is a major issue because we've got a lot of people that should be living with their parents and are actually either on the streets or in a vehicle without permanent shelter. So 37% are families, which means that there's at least one parent and a child with them. There's more homelessness in urban settings, and they are not usually in the rich areas. They're usually in the poorer areas. I think there's more tolerance for homelessness in poorer areas, and there's less tolerance for it in richer areas. So many people would say that, oh, well, it's just an issue of we need better welfare for people who are poor, and that's going to keep them from being homeless. For instance, Europe has a better and bigger welfare system than we do in the United States, and therefore they have less homeless people, especially Northern Europe. But Japan actually has a worse problem with homelessness, and they have a better welfare system than we do. So I'm not sure that necessarily is going to work, but that's what the data shows. Housing costs. Again, housing is directly tied to homelessness. Meaning if you have very expensive housing, you're going to have more and more people who can't afford to live in that housing, and some of them will become homeless. But housing costs are a major concern for a lot of people. And again, in 2021, we're here at the end of 2021. Cost of housing has gone up significantly, as much as 15 or even 20% in some areas of the country. And this is a major concern for many people. If you're not middle class, then housing costs are a major concern for people. It's not just a matter of supply and demand, meaning how many houses can we build versus how many houses do we need. A lot of it's related to the laws, zoning laws that would make it more difficult to build houses or make it more difficult to build houses where people need them. So for instance, one of my favorite areas of the country is around San Francisco, where houses are just astronomically expensive. It's just crazy how little house $1 million can buy you. But anyway, the zoning laws there in San Francisco area are mostly that you only allow single dweller units, which means you can only build houses for one family. This is different from, say, an apartment building, which is a single building that could hold many families or multiple dwelling units. The zoning laws are what dictate whether you can have an apartment building or not. And if you can't have apartment buildings, then the cost of housing is a lot higher because it's just a lot more expensive to build. There's a lot less houses. The supply of houses is a lot lower. So for instance, if you have an acre of land and you say we can only have single dweller units here, well, maybe you can build 4 houses on an acre. I'm making this up, right? But if you say we can build an apartment building which can have multiple dwellings inside that building, well, now with an acre of land, you might be able to put 50 families, on that acre of land, right? And so that causes the supply to go up, which would cause the price to go down, right? Now, the solution that we've done in the United States is to make it easier for people to borrow money, because we're thinking like, okay, well, if we have a housing problem, then if we make money more available, then people will be able to buy a house who otherwise wouldn't be able to buy a house, right? The problem with that is that when we make it easier for people to buy a house by giving them easier credit loans, then more people can jump into the game, and now that you've increased the demand, right, and the supply hasn't necessarily gone up. And so housing costs are a major issue. In fact, if you wanted to solve a lot of the social problems that we've talked about so far, you could focus on 2 things: the housing and education. Those are the 2 things. If we lowered the price of housing and we increased education. In fact, they kind of go together, because if you look at the most expensive housing in this country, it's typically in areas where they have the best schools. And so if you made education amazing in all areas of the city or the country, then people wouldn't feel the pressure to buy that expensive house in an expensive neighborhood. And that actually would make the housing costs in those areas go down. And everybody gets a great education, which means people that today are getting an inferior education, and means their opportunities to do things after school is over is pretty limited. After we increase the quality of education, then now they have a lot more opportunities, and their future is a lot brighter. So. All right, let's talk about gentrification some more. The term gentrification comes from the English word gentry, which is basically just talking about a person of superior social status, right? And so even the word gentleman actually just used to refer to people men who are holding land, right? You're going to a low income residential area and you are transforming that into a high income residential area, right? And so on the surface, I look at this and I'm like, oh, that looks really nice because the place was falling down or was old or had old stuff, and now it looks very pretty. The issue with that is the people who were living there before may not be able to live there now that the rent has maybe doubled or tripled. And the neighborhood itself may be changing so that the people who could live there before are no longer able to live there, in terms of like the grocery stores and the restaurants and the other things that used to serve poor people are now serving richer people, and the poor people are forced to leave those places. Sometimes it feels like you can't do anything to, even the ways you try to help end up actually hurting. So, all right. Often this happens in downtown areas, even places like Paducah, I believe, and I think Cape Girardeau, where there's old and there's places where maybe they used to be nice and now they're no longer nice, and now there's poor people who live there because they can afford to live there, but once you bring in money and you begin rebuilding things, the poor people can no longer afford to live there, and so they are forced out. And so the shops begin to change. You have Targets and Starbucks. I guess before I move on to urban sprawl, the thing about gentrification is the city going to make a place for poor people to live, or is it just going to follow the money? Right? That's a lot of things. I think what the issue around gentrification is. Like, do cities just do whatever rich people want? And then if the rich people want a neighborhood, then the city's like, oh, okay, well, it's yours. We're not going to step in. We're not going to, protect people who have lived there for maybe 60 years. Whoever is able to pay the most money, they're the ones that get to have what they want. Or is the city going to say, you know what, we are going to acknowledge that there are some things that money can't buy, and so just because rich people want to live in a neighborhood doesn't mean that they're always going to get their way, and so we're not going to make special accommodations for them to live there. So I think that's probably the issue. And so, all right, urban sprawl is a situation where you have too much development without enough people to fill it. And so this is Los Angeles, this is Detroit, why Detroit went bankrupt actually. This is Atlanta, where you just have the cities that just seem to stretch on forever rather than going up. I mean, even 6 stories would make a really big difference if you just continue building outward these single dwelling units. And the cities that otherwise would take up a small amount of space now it's like you have a pile of dough and you're kind of just smushing it out and thinning it out so that cities just go for 60 miles in every direction. That is urban sprawl. You have a widely dispersed population and it's low density. There's not very many people. If a skyscraper is very high density, you have people going up, and then low density would be people going out, right? And so the reason why Detroit declared bankruptcy, or at least one of the reasons why they declared bankruptcy, was that they couldn't maintain the infrastructure for all of the space that Detroit took up. So that for instance, if you have people living in 1 square mile, you only have to put lights on for that 1 square mile in the streets and sewage and police. But if you take that the same number of people who would be in that 1 square mile and you spread them out so that now they're over 20 square miles, well, you still have to have sewage and lights and police for those 20 miles. So now your costs have gone way up. When people live in urban sprawl, they may have to drive for an hour or an hour and a half or 2 hours maybe each way into work because they are just living so far away from the city. And so while you could argue this is their choice, you could say, well, maybe it's their choice, but if the city is expensive to live in, but they have to work in it, they're getting away so that they can afford a house that's so far out in what they call the exurbs, really far away, then they are making a reasonable choice, but they're having to spend a lot of time in the vehicle. And time in the vehicle is, first of all, it's more expensive than we think it is. And you have a lot of time when you're not moving your body, and it's stressful to drive, and it causes anxiety, and people aren't able to exercise, and so it leads to obesity. And most people drive alone, and there isn't, for many people, there actually isn't public transportation options, but I would question whether people would take advantage of them even if they were available. I think the car has some sort of symbolic meaning for many Americans, and they like the flexibility that the car offers, whereas they think of the train or the bus as being something that is inflexible, and I think for people who have a lower social status than they want to identify themselves as having. So some new ideas would be like life without a car. Cars are expensive for individuals. They're expensive for cities as they have to maintain those roadways for those vehicles. And so there are some cities that are trying to promote walking or using public transportation and making it so that people can get along without having a vehicle. My grandmother actually lived in Queens, which is a suburb, not a suburb, it's a neighborhood of New York. And she didn't have a vehicle, but she lived in New York, and that's why she was able to do that. But she wouldn't be able to live around here without a vehicle, unless she was very flexible. Other solutions that we're doing, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and urban revitalization programs, these are trying to make it so that people can live in neighborhoods that historically they would have been excluded from because of the color of their skin. They're also trying to make home ownership available to people, but the way they're doing it is by giving them money or offering them increased loans so that you could, say, buy a house without having a down payment, right? And so while this is nice and it opens up home ownership for some, it also serves to drive up the cost of housing for many people. Housing and urban development and basically creating homes for humans can be very destructive on the natural environment. And so sustainable communities are about trying to partner between public and private organizations to have healthy growth and communities that are purposeful in how they're thinking about the health of the environment, but also the health of people, because really those two things are pretty mixed anyway. And so things like the quality of life. Typically people focus on how much money is being made, the GDP, gross domestic product. But what about the quality of life? You can think about, like, what can we do as a community to make people happier, to make people feel like I'm really living well while being in this city, right? To consider all people's core values, not just the core values of the people who are in charge, the people who have wealth, or the people who have been here a long time, right? How do you change the system so that people are having access to the desirable things? Again, the desirable things are usually pretty simple. People typically want a connection with other people or loved ones. They want good relationships, and then they want something meaningful to do, a job, volunteering, something like that. Right? Consider how how do you get people's work life, and their regular life to work together to balance? How do you have healthier people in the community? So examples would be like sponsoring 5K races. What can you do as a community to encourage people to spend time with their children without screens, things like that. So building capacity. This could be investing in community colleges, or programs that would move people from having low job skills and low income to better job skills and more income. So intentional community decisions, right? Thinking about money, true, but also thinking about the health of the community, health of the people, health of the natural world, so that people are able to be there longer. Right? Ultimately, sustainability is about being able to continue doing what you're doing in the long term. All right. Well, that is chapter 14.